When James Maxwell pulled out a $100 bill at the Golden Fork restaurant and demanded the black waitress sing for his entertainment, he thought he was just playing another cruel game. He didn't know that Sarah Johnson came from a long line of singers whose voices had been both weapon and shield. He couldn't have known that his own wife kept a 60-year-old photograph of their grandmothers, back when music almost bridged Charleston's racial divide. And he certainly didn't know that forcing Sarah to sing Amazing Grace would unearth a buried story of friendship, betrayal, and a dream of harmony that refused to die. Sarah Johnson's fingers traced the edge of the pristine white tablecloth as she wiped down table 12 at the Golden Fork. The crystal chandelier above sparkled like falling stars, casting tiny rainbows across the crisp linen. 10 years of waiting. Tables had taught her to move carefully beneath those sparkling lights. One broken crystal would cost 3 weeks of her wages. "Sarah, honey, you're humming again," Miss Betty whispered as she passed by with a stack of polished plates. The older waitress gave her a gentle smile. "You know Mr. Peterson doesn't like it." Sarah pressed her lips together, catching herself mid-tune. She hadn't even realized she was humming her mother's favorite hymn. Music had a way of sneaking out of her, like water finding cracks in a dam. "Thanks, Miss Betty," she whispered back, forcing her thoughts toward the evening ahead. The Golden Fork was Charleston's finest restaurant, where old money came to remind itself how important it was. Sarah knew every scratch on the dark wooden floors, every painting of pastoral scenes that lined the burgundy walls. She knew which tables wobbled and which chairs creaked, and how to serve from the left without ever letting her arm brush against a customer's shoulder. Her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. Probably Grandma Rose checking in about little Maya. Sarah's 8-year-old daughter would be doing homework now, sitting at their kitchen table while Grandma Rose made dinner. The same table where Sarah had done her homework as a child, dreaming of music school while her mother worked double shifts to save for tuition. Those dreams had died with her mother 6 years ago. "Everyone, attention please!" Mr. Peterson's voice cut through her thoughts. The restaurant manager stood at the host station, his thin frame rigid with importance. "James Maxwell is hosting a dinner party here tonight. 12 guests in the private dining room at 7 sharp. A ripple of tension passed through the staff. Everyone knew Maxwell, the biggest real estate developer in Charleston, known for buying historic buildings and turning them into luxury condos. Known for his cruel sense of humor, too, and for leaving $100 tips with handwritten critiques of the service. "Sarah, you'll be their server tonight," Mr. Peterson continued. "No mistakes, no humming, no personal touches, just perfect service." Sarah's stomach tightened, but she nodded. She needed this job. Maya needed new shoes for school, and Grandma Rose's arthritis medicine wasn't covered by insurance. "Yes, sir, I understand." The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows as Sarah prepared the private dining room. She arranged the silver just so, each fork and knife measured against her pinky finger for spacing. The white roses in the centerpiece had to be pristine, each petal perfect. Maxwell was known for sending flowers back if they showed even a hint of wilt. As she worked, Sarah's mind drifted to the dream she'd had last night. Her mother, standing in their old church, conducting the choir. In the dream, Sarah had been singing soprano, her voice soaring up to heaven while her mother beamed with pride. She'd woken up with tears on her cheeks, and her daughter asking why she was crying. "Just missing Grandma Joyce," she'd told Maya, smoothing her daughter's curls. "She would have loved hearing you sing in the school concert next week." The thought of Maya's concert brought a smile to Sarah's face as she adjusted the last place setting. Her daughter had inherited the family's musical gift, along with her grandmother's determination. Maya practiced her choir songs every evening, filling their small apartment with joy. "They're here," Miss Betty called from the main dining room. "And Lord have mercy, they've already been drinking." Sarah squared her shoulders and checked her reflection in a silver serving tray. Her black dress uniform was spotless, her kinky hair pulled back neatly in a bun, her name tag straight. She could do this. She'd served difficult customers before. The first guests filtered into the private dining room, the women in designer dresses, the men in suits that cost more than Sarah made in a year. Their voices carried that particular tone of Charleston's elite, part bourbon, part old plantation money, part casual cruelty. Then James Maxwell entered, and the room's energy shifted. He was a tall man with silver hair and cold blue eyes, his smile as sharp as a knife. Sarah had seen him in the newspaper, usually standing in front of some historic building he planned to revitalize. "Well, well," Maxwell drawled, looking around the room. "Peterson's outdone himself tonight. Everything looks perfect." His gaze landed on Sarah, and his smile widened just enough to show teeth. "And we have new staff. How delightful!" "Good evening, sir," Sarah said, her voice steady and professional. "Welcome to the Golden Fork. May I start you with our wine list?" Maxwell waved his hand dismissively. "Bring us 4 bottles of the Chateau Margaux 2015. And be careful with it, girl. Each bottle costs more than you make in a month." His companions laughed, and Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. But her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "Stand tall, baby. Your dignity ain't in their hands unless you put it there." So, Sarah stood tall, smiled politely, and went to fetch the wine. As she walked through the kitchen, she heard Maxwell's voice carry through the door. "These historic places need proper management. Can't have just anyone handling the finer things in life." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the wine bottles, but she took a deep breath and began to hum softly. Her mother's hymn again, a habit she couldn't break. The melody steadied her, like her mother's hand on her shoulder. She didn't know it yet, but that hymn would change everything before the night was over. For now, though, she just carefully lifted the expensive wine and prepared to serve it with perfect form. While somewhere across town, her daughter practiced her choir songs under Grandma Rose's proud gaze, carrying on a musical legacy that was about to shake the foundations of Charleston's high society. Sarah balanced the silver wine tray with practiced grace as she re-entered the private dining room. The crystal wine glasses clinked softly as she moved, a delicate sound that reminded her of wind chimes on her grandmother's porch. Her steps were measured, careful. 1, 2, 3, just as Miss Betty had taught her years ago. Finally, Maxwell drawled, his voice carrying over the dinner party's chatter. "I was beginning to think you'd gotten lost between here and the wine cellar." More laughter rippled around the table. Sarah kept her face neutral as she began the wine service, her movements precise. Left side, label facing the guest. Perfect. Quarter turn of the bottle. The first pour went to Mrs. Maxwell, a slim woman with carefully styled gray blonde hair and sad eyes who hadn't joined in the laughter. "Thank you," Mrs. Maxwell whispered, so softly Sarah almost missed it. The wine. Service continued smoothly until Sarah reached Maxwell himself. As she leaned in to pour, he shifted his chair back suddenly, causing her to stumble slightly. A drop of wine, just one, splashed onto the pristine tablecloth. "Oh my," Maxwell said, his voice dripping with false concern. "How clumsy. That's coming out of your pay, I assume." "I apologize, sir," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the churning in her stomach. "I'll have the tablecloth replaced immediately." "No, no," Maxwell waved his hand. "Let's not disrupt the evening further. though I do think we deserve some compensation for the diminished ambiance." He paused, a cruel smile playing at his lips. "I couldn't help but notice you humming earlier. You fancy yourself a singer, do you?" Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "No, sir. It's just a habit." "Now don't be modest," Maxwell insisted, his voice growing louder. "Everyone, our server here is apparently a musician. Isn't that charming? Why don't you give us a little performance? To make up for the wine incident?" The blood drained from Sarah's face. Around the table, Maxwell's guests shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. Mrs. Maxwell stared intently at her wine glass, her knuckles white around the stem. "I'm not really," Sarah began, but Maxwell cut her off. "I insist," he said, pulling a $100 bill from his wallet and placing it on the table. "Consider it a generous tip for your entertainment." His eyes glittered with malice. "Unless, of course, you're not as talented as you seem to think you are." Sarah's mind raced. She could feel Miss Betty watching anxiously from the doorway, could sense Mr. Peterson hovering nearby, unwilling to intervene. The $100 bill lay on the white tablecloth like a challenge. In that moment, Sarah heard her mother's voice so clearly, she almost turned to look for her. "Music isn't for them, baby. It's for your soul. When you sing, you're telling our story." Then another memory surfaced. Maya, just that morning, practicing her choir song in their kitchen. "Mommy, Grandma Rose says our family's always been singers. Is that true?" "Mr. Maxwell," Sarah began, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't—" "Oh, come now," he interrupted. "Surely you know at least one song? Amazing Grace, perhaps? That's simple enough for everyone." He winked at his companions, several of whom forced uncomfortable laughs. The $100 bill seemed to mock her from the table. Maya needed new shoes. Grandma Rose's medicine wasn't going to pay for itself, but this wasn't about money anymore. This was about dignity, about legacy, about every time her mother and grandmother had been forced to swallow their pride. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, remembering Sunday mornings in church. Her mother's voice strong and clear beside her. Remembering Grandma Rose's stories about singing on street corners during protests, about how music had been their weapon and their shield. "Very well, sir," she said quietly. Her hands stopped trembling as she set down the wine tray. In her mind, she could see Maya and Grandma Rose at their kitchen table, could hear their voices joining with her mother's, generations of strength flowing through her veins. The room fell silent as Sarah took a deep breath. She didn't look at Maxwell or his guests. Instead, she looked up at the crystal chandelier, its light fracturing into 1,000 tiny rainbows, just like the ones that danced across her mother's choir robe all those years ago. And then she began to sing. The first note of Amazing Grace floated through the air like a prayer. Sarah's voice, rich with the weight of history and heavy with the pain of loss, filled every corner of the room. This wasn't the polite, restrained version sung in white churches. This was the song as her grandmother had taught it to her mother, as her mother had taught it to her. Full of blue notes and bent tones, a cry of sorrow and a shout of triumph all at once. Maxwell's smirk froze on his face. Mrs. Maxwell's wine glass slipped from her fingers, though no one seemed to notice the spreading red stain. In the doorway, Miss Betty pressed her hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. As Sarah sang, she wasn't in the Golden Fork anymore. She was in her grandmother's kitchen, learning harmony while snapping peas. She was in the old church, watching her mother direct the choir. She was in her own kitchen this morning, teaching Maya the songs that had carried their family through generations of hardship and hope. When the last note faded away, the silence that followed was absolute. Sarah opened her eyes to find every face in the room transformed. Some were crying openly. Others looked shocked, as if they'd been struck. Mrs. Maxwell was staring at her with an expression Sarah couldn't quite read. Recognition? Longing? Guilt? But it was Maxwell's face that had changed the most. His carefully constructed mask of superiority had cracked, revealing something underneath that looked almost like fear. His hand, still resting near the $100 bill, trembled slightly. What Sarah didn't know, couldn't know yet, was that her voice had just unlocked a door that had been sealed for decades. In that moment, as the last echoes of Amazing Grace faded from the Golden Fork's private dining room, the carefully constructed walls of Charleston's high society began to crack, and a story buried for generations began its journey toward the light. But for now, Sarah simply stood there, her grandmother's dignity in her spine, her mother's strength in her heart, and her daughter's future in her voice. The silence in the dining room shattered as Mrs. Maxwell suddenly stood up, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. "I need some air," she whispered, hurrying from the room. Her husband half rose to follow, then sank back down, his face a mix of confusion and anger. As Sarah watched Mrs. Maxwell's retreat, her mind drifted back to another hasty exit 20 years ago when she was just 8 years old. "Grandma Rose, why's Mama crying?" young Sarah asked, watching her mother rush out of their small kitchen. The smell of burning cornbread filled the air. Her mother had never let something burn before. Grandma Rose turned off the oven and pulled Sarah into her lap, her warm arms wrapping around the little girl like a protective shield. The kitchen chairs always creaked, but Grandma's favorite chair had a special song, a gentle swoosh squeak that matched the rhythm of her rocking. "Your mama's hurting, baby," Grandma Rose said, her voice soft and musical even when she wasn't singing. "Sometimes the world tries to take our music away, tries to make us small. But you remember what I always say? Our songs are bigger than their walls," Sarah recited, snuggling closer to her grandmother's chest. "That's right, sweet pea. Your great-great-grandmother sang while she picked cotton. Your great-grandmother sang in the face of men with fire in their hands and hate in their hearts. I sang on street corners when they said we couldn't enter through the front door." Sarah looked up at her grandmother's face, seeing the strength in her deep brown eyes. "Did they try to stop you from singing?" "Grandma!" Grandma Rose was quiet for a moment, rocking slowly in that creaking chair. Outside their window, a mockingbird trilled, and she smiled. "They tried, baby. Lord, how they tried. But you know what? Our music isn't just in our voices. It's in our bones, our blood, our souls. It's the way we love, the way we hope, the way we remember." She shifted Sarah in her lap so they were face to face. "Let me tell you about the summer of 1963, when I was just a little older than you are now." The memory swirled like honey in tea as Sarah remembered that afternoon. Grandma Rose had told her about singing at protests, about how music had been their weapon and their shield. She spoke about a particular day when she'd been chosen to sing at a church gathering, a day that changed everything. "I was scared. Baby," Grandma Rose had said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "There were some powerful people there who didn't want to hear our songs, didn't want to hear our truth. But my mama, your great-grandmother, she told me something I never forgot. She said, 'Rosalie, when they try to shame you, let your voice be your power. Young Sarah had absorbed every word, not fully understanding then how those stories would shape her life. "What happened at the church, Grandma?" Grandma Rose's eyes had grown distant. "I sang Amazing Grace. Sang it like my mama taught me, like her mama taught her. And baby?" She paused, touching Sarah's cheek gently. "Something magical happened. The people who came to mock us, to shame us, they couldn't. The truth in that song was too strong." Later that evening, Sarah's mother had emerged from her room, eyes red but spine straight. She'd gathered Sarah and Grandma Rose at the piano, the old upright that took up too much space in their tiny living room, but was never once called a burden. "Mama," she'd said to Grandma Rose, "teach Sarah the harmony for wading in the water." It's time she learned the songs that saved us. That night became the first of many music lessons. Sarah learned not just notes and rhythms, but the history woven into each melody. Grandma Rose taught her how spirituals had hidden messages for escaping slaves, how gospel music had fueled the civil rights movement, how their families' voices had been passed down like precious heirlooms. "Music isn't just about singing, pretty child," Grandma Rose would say. "It's about singing true. When you open your mouth, you're not just carrying a tune, you're carrying your ancestors' dreams, their hopes, their strength." Sarah remembered one particular evening when she'd come home from school in tears. Some girls had made fun of her voice during music class, saying it was too churchy. Grandma Rose had sat her down at the kitchen table and made her a cup of sweet tea. "Child, let me tell you about your great-aunt Bessie. She had a voice that could shake the stars loose from the sky. But one day, a rich white woman heard her singing while she cleaned houses. That woman offered your great-aunt money to perform at her parties, to sing the songs she wanted, the way she wanted." "Did Aunt Bessie do it?" Sarah had asked, sipping her tea. Grandma Rose's face had grown serious. "No, baby. She knew what that woman really wanted. To own her voice, to turn our sacred songs into entertainment. Your great-aunt looked that woman in the eye and said, 'Ma'am, these songs aren't for sale.'" Now, standing in the Golden Fork's private dining room, Sarah felt the weight of those lessons, those stories, those songs. She understood why her mother had cried that day in the kitchen. Someone had tried to buy her silence, just like they'd tried with Great-Aunt Bessie. The $100 bill still lay on the white tablecloth, but it looked different now. It wasn't a tip or a bribe or even an insult. It was a test, the same test her family had faced for generations. And like them, she had answered with music, with truth, with dignity. Sarah felt a presence beside her and turned to see Miss Betty, tears still streaming down her face. The older waitress squeezed her hand gently. "Child," she whispered, "your grandmother taught you well." What Miss Betty didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was just how well Grandma Rose had prepared Sarah for this moment. Because 20 years ago, in that creaking rocking chair, Grandma Rose had left out one crucial detail about that church gathering in 1963. A detail that would soon turn the Golden Fork's elegant dining room into ground zero for long-buried truths. But for now, Sarah simply squeezed Miss Betty's hand back, her grandmother's lessons echoing in her heart. "When they try to shame you, let your voice be your power." "I believe," Maxwell's voice cut through the silence like a knife, "that we should order." His words came out strained, different from his earlier smugness. He wouldn't meet Sarah's eyes now. Sarah. Mr. Peterson appeared at her elbow, his face a mix of worry and wonder. "Perhaps you should take a moment in the kitchen." But before Sarah could move, Mrs. Maxwell returned to the room. Her face was composed, but her eyes were red-rimmed. She walked straight to Sarah, ignoring her husband's questioning look. "That arrangement," Mrs. Maxwell said softly. "The way you bent those notes in the third verse? I've only heard it sung that way once before." Her hands trembled as she reached for her purse. Do you know a Rose Johnson?" The room grew still again. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. "She's my grandmother." Mrs. Maxwell pulled out an old photograph, creased and worn at the edges. This was taken at the First Baptist Church in 1963. She held it out to Sarah with shaking fingers. Sarah took the photo, and her breath caught in her throat. There was Grandma Rose, young and beautiful, standing on church steps. Beside her stood another young woman, their arms linked, both wearing choir robes. The other woman looked remarkably like Mrs. Maxwell. "That's my grandmother, Eleanor," Mrs. Maxwell whispered. "They were in the choir together, best friends until Diana." Maxwell's voice held a warning. This isn't the time or place. But Sarah barely heard him. She was staring at the photo, at the church in the background, the same church where her mother had later directed the choir, where she had first learned to sing harmony, where Maya now practiced with her school chorus. "Would you?" Mrs. Maxwell hesitated, then seemed to find her courage. "Would you sing another? The way Rose taught it?" Maxwell's hand tightened around his wine glass. "Diana, that's enough. We're here for dinner, not a concert." "No, James." Mrs. Maxwell's voice grew stronger. "I've been quiet for too long." She turned to Sarah. "Do you know wading in the water?" Sarah nodded, her throat tight with emotion. Of course she knew it. It was the first song her mother had insisted she learn that night so long ago. She closed her eyes, remembering her mother's voice, her grandmother's lessons. The melody rose from deep within her, the same way it had risen from generations of her family. "Wade in the water," she began softly, the words carrying ancient wisdom. "Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water." Mrs. Maxwell's voice joined in on the harmony, hesitant at first, then growing stronger. It was clear she knew the arrangement, knew exactly where to place each note. Their voices twined together, just as their grandmothers had done 60 years before. Around the table, Maxwell's guests sat transfixed. Even the kitchen staff had stopped to listen, gathering in the doorway. Miss Betty was openly crying again, and Mr. Peterson seemed to have forgotten his usual rigid propriety. As they sang, Sarah felt something shifting in the room, like ice breaking up on a river. Each verse carried memories. Her mother teaching this song to the children's choir, Grandma Rose explaining its hidden meanings, the way it had guided people to freedom long ago. But there was something else in Mrs. Maxwell's voice, a pain, a longing, a story waiting to be told. Their harmony spoke of more than just music. It spoke of friendship torn apart, of secrets kept too long, of wounds that had never properly healed. When they finished, Mrs. Maxwell reached for Sarah's hand. "Rose Johnson taught my grandmother that arrangement. They were going to open a music school together. Did you know that? They had dreams of teaching children." "Diana." Maxwell stood up abruptly. "That's ancient history. It has nothing to do with..." "It has everything to do with tonight, James." Mrs. Maxwell's voice was quiet, but firm. "You tried to shame this young woman, just like your father tried to shame our grandmothers. But you heard her voice. You can't shame someone who carries that much truth." Sarah looked between them, feeling the weight of history pressing down. There was more to this story, much more. Why had the music school never opened? What had torn apart the friendship between their grandmothers? And why did Maxwell seem so afraid of these old memories? Miss Betty stepped forward, breaking the tension. "Sarah, honey, the kitchen needs you." She gave Mrs. Maxwell an apologetic smile. "If you'll excuse us, ma'am." As Sarah turned to go, Mrs. Maxwell pressed the old photograph into her hands. "Keep it," she whispered. "And please, tell Rose. Tell her Eleanor's granddaughter remembers the songs." In the kitchen, Sarah leaned against the wall, her hands shaking as she studied the photograph. She had seen her grandmother's face in 1,000 expressions: loving, stern, proud, worried. But she had never seen her look as carefree as she did in this picture, laughing with her arm around Eleanor. "Sarah," Miss Betty touched her shoulder gently. "You okay, child?" "I don't know," Sarah answered honestly. "There's something here, Miss Betty, something bigger than just tonight." "There surely is," Miss Betty agreed. "And knowing your grandmother, she's been waiting for just this moment to let it all come to light." What neither of them knew yet was just how right they were. Because in that old photograph, barely visible in the background, was a sign in front of the church. And on that sign was the key to understanding why Maxwell had gone pale at his wife's words. A truth that would shake Charleston's social foundations to their core. But for now, Sarah carefully tucked the photograph into her apron pocket and picked up her serving tray. She had a job to finish. Dignity intact, voice unsilenced, just as her grandmother had taught her. Just as generations of strong women had taught their daughters, "Let your voice be your power, and truth will find its way home." Sarah's phone buzzed in her apron pocket as she gathered empty plates from the dining room. Maxwell and his guests had finished their meals in uncomfortable silence, broken only by quiet requests for water or wine. Mrs. Maxwell hadn't touched her food, instead sitting with her hands folded in her lap, lost in thought. Stepping into the kitchen, Sarah checked her phone. A text from Grandma Rose glowed on the screen. "Maya sang her heart out at practice today. Says she's ready for next week's concert. You coming home soon, baby?" Sarah's throat tightened. If Grandma Rose only knew what had happened tonight, how their family's past had suddenly crashed into the present like a wave breaking on shore. "Sarah?" Mrs. Maxwell's voice made her jump. The older woman had followed her into the kitchen, looking out of place among the steel counters and busy staff. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but I need to tell you something. Something I should have said years ago." Miss Betty appeared at Sarah's side, protective as always. "Ma'am, this is staff only." "It's okay, Miss Betty," Sarah said softly. She gestured to the small break room off the main kitchen. "We can talk in there, Mrs. Maxwell." The break room was tiny, with just a scratched table and 2 chairs, but it offered privacy. Mrs. Maxwell sat down, her designer dress a stark contrast to the humble surroundings. She pulled another photograph from her purse, this one even older than the first. "This was taken the day they signed the lease," she said, sliding the photo across the table. "For the music school." Sarah picked up the photograph with trembling fingers. There were their grandmothers again, standing in front of an old building. They held a key between them, their faces bright with hope. A sign in the window read, "Coming soon, Grace Notes Music Academy." They were going to teach children from all backgrounds, Mrs. Maxwell continued, her voice thick with emotion. Black, white, rich, poor. Music was going to be their bridge across Charleston's divided waters. She paused, twisting her diamond wedding ring. "But then, my father-in-law found out." Sarah's heart pounded. What happened? James Maxwell II was a powerful man in 1963. When he learned his mother, my grandmother Eleanor, was planning to open an integrated music school with her best friend, Mrs. Maxwell's voice cracked. He threatened to cut off her inheritance, to ruin Rose's husband's business, to make sure no bank in Charleston would ever give them a loan. The pieces started falling into place in Sarah's mind. So they had to give up their dream. Mrs. Maxwell shook her head, a fierce pride lighting her eyes. No, they refused. That's when he did something unforgivable. She reached for the first photograph, the one of their grandmothers on the church steps. Look closely at the church sign in the background. Sarah squinted at the faded image. The sign read, First Baptist Church presents A Night of Gospel. Proceeds to benefit Grace Note's Music Academy. They were raising money, Sarah whispered, understanding dawning, to open the school without bank loans. Yes, the concert was scheduled for June 15, 1963. Your grandmother was to be the featured soloist. Mrs. Maxwell's hands clenched in her lap. The night before, someone set fire to the building they'd leased. The investigation called it an accident, but it wasn't, Sarah finished, her voice hard. No, it wasn't. Mrs. Maxwell pulled out one final photograph. This was taken the morning after. The image showed the charred shell of the building. In the foreground, Rose and Eleanor stood holding each other, their faces streaked with tears, but their backs straight with dignity. Behind them, James Maxwell II could be seen watching from his car, his expression hidden behind dark glasses. Grandmother Eleanor never sang again after that, Mrs. Maxwell said quietly. She withdrew from the choir, stopped teaching music, rarely even played the piano. But Rose... She looked up at Sarah with wonder. Rose kept singing, didn't she? Yes, Sarah nodded, thinking of all the lessons, all the stories, all the strength passed down through song. She never stopped. I found these photographs in my grandmother's attic after she passed, Mrs. Maxwell continued, along with letters from your grandmother and sheet music they'd arranged together. I've been searching for Rose for years, but she'd moved away from their old neighborhood, and I was afraid to ask James about it. Sarah's phone buzzed again. Another text from Grandma Rose. Maya wants to know if you'll sing with her at the concert. Says it's not the same without her mama's harmony. Looking at the phone screen, then back at the photographs of two young women who had dared to dream of harmony across Charleston's racial divide, Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. Mrs. Maxwell, she said, would you like to meet my grandmother? She'll be at Maya's school concert next week. Diana, Mrs. Maxwell corrected gently. Please, call me Diana. And yes, I would love that more than anything. She hesitated. But James, let him try to stop you, Sarah said with quiet confidence. Some songs are stronger than fear. What neither woman knew in that moment was that James Maxwell was standing just outside the break room door, his face pale as he listened to his family's shameful secret finally coming to light. In his pocket was a letter he'd found in his father's desk after the old man's death. A letter that would complete this story in ways no one could imagine. But for now, Sarah and Diana sat in the humble break room of the Golden Fork, two women, connected by their grandmother's courage, their family's music, and a dream of harmony that refused to die. James Maxwell's hands trembled as he pulled the old letter from his pocket. He'd found it 3 months ago, hidden in his father's desk after the funeral. He'd read it 100 times since then, but had never found the courage to show it to his wife. The break room door was still closed, the voices of Sarah and Diana murmuring inside. He could walk away now, keep the secret buried, protect his family's reputation. But Sarah's voice, singing "Amazing Grace," echoed in his memory. And for the first time in his life, James Maxwell chose truth over pride. He knocked on the door. Both women looked up as he entered, their expressions guarded. Diana started to rise, but he held up his hand. "Please," he said, his voice rough. "There's something you both need to see." He placed the letter on the scratched break room table. "I found this after my father died." The letter was written on faded Grace Notes Music Academy letterhead, dated June 14, 1963, the day before the fire. Dear James, you win. Rose and I will announce tomorrow that the school is finished. Just please, leave her family alone. They're innocent in this. But know this, you can burn our building, you can threaten our families, you can try to silence our music. But someday, someone will sing the truth. And when that day comes, I pray you'll remember that harmony is stronger than hate. Your mother, Eleanor Maxwell. Sarah's hands shook as she read the words. Diana covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. He kept it all these years, James said quietly. Along with these, he pulled out a stack of newspaper clippings, reviews of Eleanor and Rose's performances, announcements about the music school, a small article about the fire titled "Local Business Plans Go Up in Smoke." I didn't know, he continued. Growing up, I never understood why grandmother Eleanor stopped singing, why she flinched whenever father talked about the old days in Charleston. But now, he looked at Sarah. When I heard you sing tonight, it was like hearing a ghost. You sound just like her, like both of them. James, Diana whispered, reaching for her husband's hand. But he pulled away. No, he said firmly. No more pretending. No more hiding. He turned to Sarah. I owe you an apology, not just for tonight, but for carrying on my father's cruelty without even knowing it. When I mocked you for singing, his voice broke. I was doing exactly what he did to them. Sarah looked at the letter again, at Eleanor's brave, heartbroken words. She tried to protect my grandmother, she said softly. And Rose protected her right back, Diana added, by never telling anyone who was really responsible for the fire. She kept Eleanor's secret, kept her safe from James II's anger. Mr. Peterson appeared in the doorway, looking anxious. I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have other guests. Cancel my party's bill, James said abruptly, and give Sarah the rest of the night off, with full pay. He managed a small, sad smile. It's the least I can do, considering my family owes her family 60 years of music school tuition. Sarah's phone buzzed again. This time it was a photo from Grandma Rose, Maya at the piano, practicing her concert piece. The caption read, She's got Eleanor's spirit and Joyce's voice. Music finds a way. Sarah showed the photo to Diana, whose eyes filled with fresh tears. She's beautiful, Diana whispered. How old is she? 8, Sarah answered. The same age I was when Mama started, teaching me the old songs. James stared at the photo of the little girl at the piano, then at the letter in his hands. Slowly, carefully, he folded the paper and held it out to Sarah. This belongs to your family now, he said. And he took a deep breath. I'd like to make things right, not just with a free dinner or a night's pay, but really right. The building where the music school was supposed to be. I own it now. It's been sitting empty since my company bought it last year. I've been planning to tear it down for condos, but... James? Diana's voice was full of hope. Maybe it's time for Grace Notes Music Academy to finally open its doors, he said quietly. With proper funding this time. A trust, perhaps, in Eleanor and Rose's names. Sarah thought of Maya, of all the children who could learn the songs, the stories, the strength that music brought. My grandmother always says that grace notes are the things that make a song special, not the main melody, but the little touches that give it heart. She's right, Diana smiled through her tears. And it's time we added some grace notes to Charleston's song. Outside the break room, the restaurant had grown quiet. The last customers were leaving. The kitchen staff, cleaning up. But in that small room, something powerful was being born. A dream that had waited 60 years to become reality. Miss Betty appeared with cups of coffee, her wise eyes taking in the scene. "I remember that music school plan," she said softly. "My mama was going to send me there for piano lessons. She said it was going to change everything." "It still can," Sarah replied, thinking of Maya's upcoming concert, of all the photographs and stories that needed to be shared, of the healing that could finally begin. What none of them knew yet was that the letter wasn't the only thing James Maxwell II had kept. In his safety deposit box, sealed away for decades, was a recording, a single vinyl record of Rose and Eleanor's last performance together. And when that record finally played again, the last piece of the puzzle would fall into place. But for now, Sarah pulled out her phone to call Grandma Rose. It was time to tell her that the song she and Eleanor had started so long ago was finally ready for its next verse. 1 week later, the elementary school auditorium buzzed with excitement. Parents filled the rows of seats, programs rustling in their hands. Up front, the children's choir stood arranged on risers, their Sunday best gleaming. Under the stage lights, Maya Johnson stood in the front row, her yellow dress matching the ribbons in her hair. Her eyes scanned the crowd until she found her mother and grandmother sitting together in the third row. Sarah gave her a thumbs up, while Grandma Rose dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. 2 rows behind them sat James and Diana Maxwell. Frandes, choir director, stepped forward, raising her hands for silence. "Tonight's final performance," she announced, "will be a special arrangement of Amazing Grace, featuring soloist Maya Johnson." Sarah reached for her grandmother's hand as Maya stepped forward. The spotlight caught her daughter's face, showing the same quiet dignity that had marked generations of Johnson women. But before Maya could begin, the back doors of the auditorium opened. An orderly from Charleston Memorial Hospital wheeled in, an elderly woman in a blue dress. Diana Maxwell gasped. "Mama?" James whispered, rising to his feet. "But the doctors said..." Eleanor Maxwell II, now 97 years old, had insisted on leaving the hospital for this night. Her nurse had argued it was too risky, but Eleanor had simply said, "Some songs you have to hear in person." The old woman's eyes found Rose Johnson in the crowd. For a moment, 60 years melted away, and they were young again, standing on the steps of First Baptist Church, their voices twined in harmony. Maya took a deep breath and began to sing. The first note soared pure and clear, just as Sarah's had in the Golden Fork. But then something magical happened. From her seat, Grandma Rose began to hum the harmony, the same arrangement she and Eleanor had created so long ago. And then, from her wheelchair, Eleanor's voice joined in, thin and wavering, but finding strength with each note. She hadn't sung in public since the night before the fire. But tonight, hearing her best friend's harmony again, the music flowed like water, breaking through a dam. Diana pulled the vinyl record from her purse, the one they'd found in James II's safety deposit box. Its label read, Eleanor and Rose, Amazing Grace, Original Arrangement, June 14, 1963. "We found a record player that could handle it," she whispered to Sarah. "It's their last recording together the night before." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Maya's voice grew stronger, carrying her family's legacy. The other children joined in, their young voices lifting the old song to the auditorium's rafters. In that moment, past and present merged, as three generations of voices, Maya's, Sarah's, and Rose's, sang the harmony Eleanor and Rose had created 60 years before. After the applause died down, after Maya had run into her mother's arms, after Eleanor and Rose had held each other and cried, James Maxwell stood up to make an announcement. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice carrying across the now quiet auditorium, "renovation begins on 423 King Street. Many of you may know it as the old Wilson Building. But some of you," he looked at Rose and Eleanor, "remember what it was meant to be." He held up the original Grace Notes Music Academy sign, rescued from his father's storage. "In 3 months, these doors will open again. Every child who wants to learn music will have a place here. Every voice will be heard." Sarah felt Maya squeeze her hand. "Can I take lessons there, Mama?" "Of course, baby." Sarah smiled through her tears. "Your great-grandmother's going to teach you herself." Rose Johnson stood up slowly, her voice strong and clear. "And this time," she said, looking at her old friend Eleanor, "nobody's going to stop the music." Later that night, after the celebrations had quieted after Maya had fallen asleep still wearing her yellow dress, Sarah sat with her grandmother on their porch swing, the same swing where she'd learned her first harmonies, where she'd cried over her mother's death, where she'd sung Maya her first lullabies. "Grandma," she said softly, "did you know? All these years, did you know about the letter? About Eleanor trying to protect us?" Rose smiled, the porch light gentle on her face. "Baby, I knew Eleanor Maxwell had the strongest heart of anyone I'd ever met, just like I knew someday the truth would find its voice." She patted Sarah's hand. "Music has a way of waiting for the right moment to be heard." Sarah thought about the night at the Golden Fork, about Maxwell's cruel game that had backfired so beautifully. "You always said our songs were bigger than their walls." "That's right," Rose nodded. "And now Maya will grow up in a world where those walls are finally falling down. She'll sing in a place her great-grandmother and Eleanor dreamed, up, where music brings people together instead of keeping them apart." From inside the house came the soft sound of Maya humming in her sleep. The same song her mother had sung in the restaurant. The same harmony her great-grandmother had arranged with Eleanor. The same truth that had waited 60 years to be heard. And so the story that began with an attempt to shame became a symphony of healing, proving once again what Rose Johnson had always known. When you sing your truth, Grace Notes have a way of finding their place in the melody. In the end, it wasn't just about a song or a school or even a 60-year-old wrong made right. It was about the power of voices raised together, about dreams that refuse to die, about the kind of harmony that can only come when hearts are brave enough to sing their truth. Maya would grow up knowing this story, understanding that every time she opened her mouth to sing, she carried the hopes of 2 families, the dreams of two friends, and the proof that some songs are stronger than silence, stronger than shame, stronger than hate. And that, perhaps, was the greatest grace note of all. If you enjoyed this story of family, forgiveness, and the power of music to heal old wounds, please let us know where you're listening from in the comments below. We love hearing how these stories of everyday courage touch hearts around the world. Your simple click on the like button helps share these messages of hope and understanding with others who might need to hear them. Consider subscribing to our channel for more stories that celebrate the strength of the human spirit and remind us that kindness can change lives, one voice at a time. Remember, just like Sarah and Maya, each of us has the power to turn moments of shame into triumph and to help build bridges where there once were walls. Until next time, keep singing your truth.